If you've ever felt like the whole world was watching you, waiting for you to break, then you're going to understand this story. It starts in a place called Red Willow Crossing, Kansas, in the year 1877, and it starts with a woman and her two sons tied to a fence post in the middle of town. The sky that day was a hard, pale blue, like a sheet of ice stretched over the world. There wasn't a cloud in sight, and the wind coming off the Flint Hills was mean and low, kicking up dust that tasted like grit and regret. Red Willow Crossing wasn't much of a town. It was more like a scar on the prairie. A few dusty streets, a general store, a church with a bell that had a crack right down the middle. The kind of place where secrets festered like a splinter under the skin. And on this morning, the town had a secret it couldn't look away from. Clara Hayes stood tied to the split-rail fence just outside the telegraph shack. Her lips were cracked, her face was swollen, and the sun had been beating down on her for hours. She didn't make a sound. She just stood there, a ghost in broad daylight. Beside her, her two boys were tied up just the same. Micah, who was 12 going on 40, stood straight and stiff, his jaw set hard. He was trying to be strong for his mother, you could see it. Then there was little Everly, only 6 years old. He'd given up hours ago and was just a small, crumpled heap against his mother's skirt, fast asleep in the middle of his own nightmare. The ropes weren't cruel, but they were deliberate. One long loop, binding them to the post, making them a spectacle for the whole town. And just to make sure everyone got the message, a note was pinned to the post right above Clara's head. It was written in a rough, angry scrawl, and it said just 4 words, "Not worth the land." Now in a town like Red Willow, folks saw everything. Curtains twitched, doors cracked open, but nobody moved. Nobody stepped forward. They were all waiting, waiting to see which way the wind would blow before they dared to get involved. They were afraid. But what they were afraid of was a lot worse than a man with a rope. And as the sun climbed higher, turning the dust to shimmering gold, it seemed like Clara and her boys would be left there to bake until they broke. But then something changed. A wagon appeared on the horizon. It creaked and groaned under the weight of oats and hay, and a big tin stove lashed to the back. And the man driving it sat tall, like he owned the very road he was on. He wore a heavy buffalo hide coat, which was strange for the season, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, hiding everything but a jagged scar on his jaw. He didn't carry a rifle where you could see it. He didn't need to. The man himself was a warning. His name was Silas Carter, and he was the kind of man who lived on the edge of town and the edge of people's patience. He was a ghost of a different sort, one that people whispered about but never confronted. Silas Carter didn't slow his wagon. He didn't even seem to notice the people peering out from their windows. His eyes were fixed on the telegraph shack. He saw the woman. He saw the boys. He saw the note. And without a word, he pulled the wagon to a stop right in the middle of the street. The whole town held its breath. The silence was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. He climbed down from the wagon, and his boots hit the dust without a sound. He wasn't a big man, not really, but he moved with a kind of heavy certainty that made the air around him feel tight. He walked straight to the fence, and the world seemed to shrink until it was just him and the woman, and the ropes that held them there. He looked at Clara, and for the first time that day she flinched. Not out of fear, but because his gaze didn't have any pity in it. It was just a fact. Like he was looking at a fallen tree or a broken gate, something that needed fixing. Her eyes, bloodshot and full of a shame that wasn't hers to carry, flicked from his face to the note above her head, then back again. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She had used up all her tears long ago. It was Micah who tried to speak, his voice a dry rasp. "Mister." Silas just held up a hand, not to silence him but to steady him, a gesture that said, "I see you, son. It's all right." Then from inside that heavy buffalo coat, Silas pulled a small, wicked-looking whittling knife. The blade caught the sun, a sliver of cold light in the oppressive heat. 3 quick movements. That's all it took. The blade whispered through the rope on Micah's wrists. "Shh, slick." The boy sagged but caught himself before he fell. Then the rope on little Everly. "Shh, slick." The little one just tumbled forward, and Silas caught him with one arm, pulling him in close like he belonged there. Finally, he cut the rope holding Clara. Schlick. Her strength gave out all at once. She pitched forward, a dead weight, and he caught her too, gathering her up as if she weighed no more than a sack of flour. He held her against his chest, her head tucked under his chin, and for a long moment he just stood there, a strange and silent monument in the middle of Red Willow Crossing. And that's when the town finally decided to breathe again. You could hear a collective gasp ripple through the houses. Mayor Purvis peeked out from behind his mercantile door. Even the preacher, Reverend Morton, was staring through the church window, but nobody said a word. Nobody moved. They just watched as Silas Carter, the man nobody knew, carried the woman and her youngest son back to his wagon. He laid them gently on the bed of hay, followed by Micah, who climbed in under his own power, his eyes never leaving Silas. Silas took off his heavy coat and draped it over them, a final, deliberate act of defiance. He climbed back into the driver's seat and slapped the reins. The wagon creaked forward, rolling past the sheriff's office. The door was open, and Sheriff Elridge was leaning against the frame, chewing on a piece of wood. "Silas," was all he said with a slow nod. Silas didn't even look at him. He just kept rolling on, heading east, out of town, toward the creek bend, where the red willows grew so thick they looked like they were weeping into the water. The town of Red Willow watched him go, and they knew deep in their bones that they had just witnessed something important. They just didn't know what. Was it an act of kindness, or was it the beginning of a war? The cabin wasn't much to look at. It was a single room, built low to the ground, almost swallowed by the tall grass and the thicket of red willows that gave the creek its name. It smelled of old wood smoke, pine sap, and something else. Loneliness. Silas carried Clara inside and laid her on his cot. It wasn't soft, just a few feed sacks stitched together over some pine planks, but it was better than the hard-packed earth she'd been standing on. He set Everly down on a braided rug near the hearth, and Micah sat beside his brother, his face a mask of suspicion. The boy didn't trust this quiet stranger, not one bit. Why would he? Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. Silas didn't say anything. He didn't offer explanations or apologies. He just moved with a quiet purpose, stoking the embers in the fireplace until a small flame flickered to life. He fetched a dipper of water and a clean cloth, kneeling beside Clara. He gently dabbed her cracked lips and wiped the dust from her forehead. She was burning with fever, her skin hot to the touch, but she didn't stir. She was lost in a deep, exhausted sleep. Everly woke up first. The little boy sat up, blinked at the strange room, and then crawled toward the warmth of the fire. He looked at Silas, this big, quiet man with the scarred face, and he didn't even cry. He just leaned into the heat and watched the flames dance. Micah, though, he just stared. He sat as straight as a fence post, his eyes drilling into Silas, daring him to make a wrong move. What did this man want? People didn't do things for free out here. Everything had a price. Silas ignored the boy's glare. He went to a small cupboard, pulled out a tin plate and half a loaf of cornbread. He broke it into pieces and set it on the floor between the two boys. Everly, without hesitation, grabbed a chunk with both hands and started eating like he hadn't seen food in a week, which he probably hadn't. Micah just watched. He was hungry. His stomach was a hard knot of emptiness, but his pride, or his fear, was stronger. He wouldn't take anything from this man until he knew the cost. It was almost evening when Clara's eyes finally fluttered open. The cabin was filled with the warm, orange glow of the fire, and the air was thick with the smell of bacon and beans simmering in a pot over the flames. Her body ached, but it was a dull ache, not the sharp, humiliating pain from the fence post. She sat up too fast, and the world spun. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. Silas turned from the fire. He was sitting on a low stool, that little knife back in his hand, carving a small piece of wood. The shavings fell to the floor in a neat little pile. "Where are they?" Clara's voice was a broken whisper. "My boys." Silas didn't even look up. He just tilted his head toward the fire. She saw them then. Everly was curled up asleep, and Micah was sitting beside him, his own eyes closed, but you could tell he was just pretending. He was listening to every sound, every breath. They were safe. They were warm. They were fed. A wave of relief so powerful it almost knocked her over washed through her. She swung her legs off the cot, her knees buckling. Silas stood up, ready to catch her, but he didn't move toward her. He let her find her own balance. She stumbled over to the hearth and saw a tin cup of water waiting for her. She drank it down, the cool liquid a balm on her raw throat. Then she turned to face him, her eyes clear for the first time. "What do you want from me?" Silas just shrugged. He wasn't a man who wasted words. The fire crackled. The wind whispered through the willows outside. It was a long time before Clara spoke again, her voice stronger now. "I can work," she said. "I can cook. I can clean. I'll earn my keep." Silas finally looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable in the firelight. "This ain't about earning," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This is about resting. Help where you can. No need to prove nothing." She stared at him then, really stared. He was built like a mountain, solid and immovable. And for the first time since her husband had died, she didn't feel like a burden. She felt seen. But as the silence stretched out, a new kind of fear began to creep in. This quiet kindness was more unsettling than outright cruelty. She understood cruelty. She knew how to survive it. But this was a language she didn't speak. What was the truth behind his generosity? No one was this good, not in this hard, unforgiving land. Every favor was a debt, every kindness a hook. She looked at this silent stranger, this man who had single-handedly defied her tormentors, and she had to wonder, what kind of trap had she just walked into? Was this cabin a sanctuary? Or was it just a different kind of cage, one with warmer walls and a more patient keeper? The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Clara discovered that keeping her hands busy kept the demons at bay. She scrubbed the hearth until the stones shone. She aired out the bedding. She patched the small tears in Silas's shirts. If her hands stayed still, her mind would wander back to that fence post, to the staring eyes of the town, to the sneering face of her brother-in-law, Ambrose Hayes. So she worked. She worked until her muscles ached and her mind was blessedly empty. Micah remained a ghost in the house. He was always watching, always listening. He shadowed his little brother, a silent 12-year-old guardian angel. He didn't trust Silas, not yet, but he studied him. He watched the way Silas moved, the way he handled his tools, the way he looked out at the horizon as if he were waiting for something. Everly, on the other hand, began to thrive in the stillness. The terror of the past few days began to fade from his eyes, replaced by a child's natural curiosity. He followed Clara around the small cabin, chattering away, asking questions, and giving names to everything. The wobbly pine stool became Old Man Crooks. A fat gray hen that scratched around outside was named Mrs. Trouble, and the small wooden bird that Silas had been carving on that first night, a bird with its wings caught in mid-flight, he carried it with him everywhere. It was his talisman, his proof that something good had happened in the middle of all the bad. Clara never asked Silas about his land, or his past, or why he lived all alone out here by the creek. But she noticed things. She saw the way his fence leaned in the west pasture, the crack that ran down the side of the water bucket, the way the wind seemed to find a hole in the tin roof and whistle a sad, lonely tune on stormy nights. She fixed what she could without being asked. She found some old nails and shored up the fence post. She used a bit of pine tar to patch the bucket. She didn't expect thanks, and she didn't get any. But the next morning, a brand new bucket was sitting by the door. That was Silas's way. He spoke in actions, not words. One afternoon, while the boys were down by the creek, skipping stones across the slow-moving water, Clara finally asked the question that had been burning a hole in her mind. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you stop for us?" Silas was chopping wood, the axe rising and falling in a steady hypnotic rhythm. Thud, pause, thud. He didn't stop. He didn't even look at her. She thought he was going to ignore her, but then he spoke, his voice low and even. "Saw a woman once," he said, the axe splitting a log clean in two. "Outside Abilene, tied to a post just like you." Thud. Folks just walked on by, like she was invisible. He set the axe down and finally turned to face her. "That memory, It stuck with me. Clara nodded slowly. That woman, she wasn't me. I know, he said. And then, so quiet she almost didn't hear it, she added, but I was getting close. Later that night, after the boys were asleep, she found Silas sitting by the fire, just staring into the flames. It was my husband's brother, she said, the words tumbling out of her before she could stop them. Ambrose Hayes. After my John died, Ambrose said the land, the debts, everything was his. He said the boys were his blood, and I was just the widow. Silas didn't say anything, but the knuckles on the hand resting on his knee went white. He said if I wanted to feed my sons, I had to earn my keep. With him. The meaning hung in the air, ugly and heavy. When I told him no, that's when he took us to town. That's when he tied us to that fence. Silas stood up abruptly and walked to the door, yanking it open. The cold night air rushed in, chilling the small cabin. He stood there, a dark silhouette against the starry sky, his back to her. You planning on going back? He asked, his voice rough. Back to him? I don't know, she whispered. There's the land, my John's land. You need to know, he said, turning to face her, his eyes blazing with a sudden, fierce intensity she'd never seen before. Because if he ever comes looking for you here, he'll find more than just a quiet man with a whittling knife. The threat was unmistakable, and in that moment, Clara realized Silas Carter wasn't just a kind man. He was a dangerous one, and she was standing right in the middle of whatever storm was brewing inside him. The next morning, a second carved bird appeared on the windowsill. This one's wings were folded, but its head was up, alert, as if it were listening for danger. Clara placed it next to the first one. A silent conversation was beginning between them, one carved in wood and offered without a word. That same day, she found a pair of work gloves by the woodpile. They were too big for her, but they were lined with soft wool. She pulled them on, and they felt like a promise. Micah saw her wearing them. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, his young face old with worry. We staying here? He asked, his voice cracking a little. Clara looked from her son's face to the two small birds on the sill. For now, she said. It was the only answer she had. A few weeks later, Clara knew she had to go back. Not to stay, but to face them. She needed supplies, flour, and coffee. But more than that, she needed to walk through Red Willow Crossing with her head held high. She left the boys with Silas. He just nodded when she told him, his eyes saying what his mouth wouldn't. Be careful. The town hadn't changed, but Clara had. As she walked down the main street, she felt the eyes on her. Mrs. Harlan, the preacher's wife, fanned herself a little faster. Two men standing outside the blacksmith shop stopped talking and just stared. But this time, Clara didn't look away. She met their gazes, her own eyes steady and clear. Inside the mercantile, Mr. Sutter, the storekeeper, looked up from his ledger, his face a mixture of surprise and guilt. Afternoon, Miss Hayes, he stammered. It's Mrs. Hayes, she corrected him, her voice soft but firm. He traded her eggs for flour and coffee, his eyes darting to her hands. They were calloused now, strong. Folks been wondering about you, he said, trying to make conversation. Folks always wonder, she replied. Doesn't mean they've earned an answer. She left the store and stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, and that's when she saw Dory Miles, the mayor's wife, standing there like a vulture waiting for something to die. Dory's smile was pure poison. Clara, dear, she cooed. So good to see you up and about. Living out there with that man, Silas Carter. Such a mystery, isn't he? And you and your boys, all alone with him, with no preacher's words said over you. Well, people talk. Clara didn't break her stride. She just turned her head and said, let them. The steel in her voice made Dory Miles take a step back. That night, Clara told Silas what had happened. The town's talking, she said. They think I'm your kept woman. Silas was fixing a hinge on the barn door. He didn't even pause his work. Are you? He asked, his voice flat. No, she snapped, her anger flaring. I work from sunup to sundown. I am not kept. He finally looked up at her, his eyes calm as a deep lake. Then their words are just wind, he said. Don't let them bother you. But they did bother her, and they bothered Micah even more. A few days later, a traveling peddler named Clem showed up at the cabin. He had a greasy smile and eyes that roamed where they shouldn't. Heard you've been keeping some interesting company, he said to Clara, leaning in close. Before she could answer, Micah was there, standing in the doorway, his small body rigid with fury. You best leave, the boy said, his voice low and dangerous. Clem just chuckled. Fiery little thing, ain't he? That was as far as he got. Silas seemed to materialize out of thin air, appearing right behind the peddler. He didn't say a word. He just stood there. But the look in his eyes made the peddler's smile vanish. Clem practically tripped over his own feet, backing away from the cabin. Later, Clara found Micah sitting by the creek, his knuckles raw and bloody. You stood up for me, she said softly. I didn't like the way he looked at you, he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. You shouldn't have to protect me, Micah. He looked up at her then, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I know, he said, but I wanted to. When they got back to the cabin, a new wooden bird was sitting on the porch rail. This one was bigger than the others. Its wings were spread wide, as if it were just about to take flight. Ready to soar, or maybe ready to fight. Clara knew then that the quiet days were over. The whispers in town were getting louder. The peddler was a warning, and Ambrose Hayes was not a man who gave up on what he considered his property. A storm was coming. She could feel it in the air, and Silas Carter's cabin, which had felt like a shelter, was about to become a battleground. The first breath of October arrived with a chill that promised a harsh winter. The leaves on the willows turned a fiery red, and the whole world seemed to be holding its breath. Then one Sunday morning, the sound of a horse, ridden hard and fast, shattered the peace. Micah saw him first, a lone rider, cutting across the field, a black shape against the golden grass. Ma! He shouted. Silas was already on his feet, moving toward the door, his body coiled like a snake ready to strike. Clara rushed onto the porch, pulling Everly behind her, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew who it was before he even got close. Ambrose Hayes. He pulled his horse to a skidding stop, showering the yard in dirt. He was a big man, broad and thick, with a cruel twist to his lips and eyes as cold and hard as river stones. Well, well, he boomed, his voice dripping with menace. Isn't this a cozy little picture? Leave Ambrose, Clara said, her voice shaking but firm. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. Now is that any way to greet family? I heard you were squatting out here on another man's charity. I've come to collect what's mine, the boys, and you. That's when Silas stepped forward. He moved from the shadows of the porch into the sunlight, and he seemed to bring the darkness with him. You're not taking anyone, Silas said, his voice quiet, but carrying more weight than Ambrose's shout. Ambrose's hand drifted down, hovering over the pistol holstered at his hip. This ain't your business, Carter. You tied up children, Silas said, taking another slow step forward. That makes it my business. I was disciplining my kin, Ambrose snarled. Now get out of my way before I move you myself. You laid your hands on her, Silas continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a deadly rumble. That's reason enough. I got a deed to her husband's land, Ambrose roared, his face turning a blotchy red. That gives me rights. You've got no rights here, Silas said. The standoff stretched, the air crackling with unspoken violence. Then behind Clara, Micah moved. Trembling with a mixture of terror and rage, he darted forward, grabbing a thick branch from the woodpile. With a choked cry, he ran at Ambrose and swung the branch with all his might, catching the big man square in the ribs. Ambrose grunted in surprise and pain, stumbling back a step. And that 1 second was all Silas needed. He moved faster than Clara would have thought possible. He closed the distance between them in a single bound, grabbed Ambrose's wrist, and twisted. There was a sickening crack of bone, and Ambrose screamed as his pistol dropped into the dust. Silas wasn't done. He slammed his fist into Ambrose's jaw, a brutal, efficient punch that sent the bigger man sprawling. Ambrose landed hard, the breath knocked out of him, spitting blood and dirt. Silas stood over him, his chest heaving, his face a mask of cold fury. I didn't bury the last man who thought he could hurt a child, Silas said, his voice so cold it could have frozen fire. But I sure as hell dug the hole for him. Fear. For the first time, Clara saw genuine fear in Ambrose's eyes. He scrambled backward, crab walking away from Silas like a man facing down a wolf. He hauled himself onto his horse, his broken wrist cradled against his chest. He glared at them, his face a mess of blood and hatred. "You'll regret this, Carter," he spat. "All of you. This ain't over. I'll be back with the law. I'll be back with the whole damn town." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his threats trailing behind him like a plume of poison smoke. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind rustling the willow leaves and Everly's quiet sobs. Micah dropped the branch, his body shaking uncontrollably now that the danger had passed. Clara knelt and pulled him into a fierce hug. She looked up at Silas, who was still staring after Ambrose, his body rigid, his hands clenched into fists. She had seen him as a savior, a protector. But in that moment, as she watched the raw, controlled violence fade from his eyes, she saw something else. She saw a man who knew how to hurt people, a man who had done it before, and the chilling thought that had been lurking in the back of her mind returned with a vengeance. She hadn't been rescued by a simple farmer. She had thrown her lot in with a killer, and his war had just landed squarely on her doorstep. The silence that followed Ambrose's departure was heavier than any sound. It filled the small cabin, pressing in on them. No one talked about what happened. They didn't have to. The bloody dust in the yard and the wild look that still lingered in Silas's eyes said it all. Something had broken open that day. That night, Micah didn't sleep with his back to the wall. He slept by the fire, a small axe from the woodpile resting near his hand. He was no longer just a boy. He was a soldier in a war he didn't understand. Clara watched him, her heart aching. This life, this constant fear, was changing her sons, hardening them in ways they shouldn't be hardened. The next day, she found Silas by the fence line, his hands working to mend a rail that wasn't even broken. He was working off the violence from the day before, channeling it into the wooden wire. "He'll be back," she said. It wasn't a question. "I know," Silas said, not looking at her. "He mentioned the law. The sheriff." "Sheriff Elridge is a paid man," Silas cut her off. "His loyalty belongs to whoever fills his pockets, and the Hayes family has deep pockets." The knot in Clara's stomach tightened, so they were truly alone. No law, no town to back them up. Just the three of them and this strange, violent man who had secrets buried so deep they cast shadows on his soul. "Who are you, Silas?" she asked, the words raw. "Really?" He finally stopped his work and turned to her. The anger was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. "I'm a man who made a promise a long time ago," he said. "To who?" "To a ghost." He wouldn't say any more. It was like trying to get answers from a stone wall. But his words hung in the air, another piece of a puzzle she couldn't solve. A ghost, a buried man, a promise. What kind of life had he lived before he came to Red Willow Crossing? A few days later, a wagon rattled up the path. It was Sheriff Elridge. He didn't get down. He just sat there, his fleshy face sweating under his hat, his eyes darting around nervously. Silas met him at the gate. "Silas," the sheriff grunted, "got a formal complaint here from Ambrose Hayes. Says you're holding his kin against their will. Says you assaulted him." "He's lying," Silas said, his voice flat. "Maybe," the sheriff said, pulling a piece of paper from his pocket. "But he's got the law on his side. This here is a warrant. I'm to escort Mrs. Hayes and her boys back to town. Ambrose will take custody of them there." Clara's blood ran cold. This was it. This was how they lost. Silas didn't move. He just stared at the sheriff, a strange, almost pitying look on his face. "Tell me, Elridge," Silas said, his voice dangerously calm. "You ever hear of a place called Three Rivers in the Colorado Territory?" The sheriff's face went pale. He licked his lips, his eyes widening in shock. I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Silas continued, his voice like silk and steel. "I think you remember a bank job that went wrong, a young deputy who ran instead of fought, a man who took his share of the stolen money and disappeared, a man who changed his name and started over as a small-town sheriff where no one would ask too many questions." The sheriff looked like he was going to be sick. He was staring at Silas not as a farmer, but as if he were seeing a ghost from his past. Who, who are you? Elridge whispered, his voice trembling. Silas smiled, but it was a cold, terrifying thing. I was the Texas Ranger they sent to hunt you down, he said. Looks like my job's finally done. Sheriff Elridge stared, his mouth hanging open. The warrant fluttered from his nerveless fingers and landed in the dust. He looked from Silas's cold eyes to the cabin, then back again. Without another word, he yanked on the reins, turned his wagon around so fast it almost tipped over, and fled back toward town as if the devil himself were on his heels. Clara stood on the porch, stunned into silence. A Texas Ranger, the legendary hardened lawman who hunted the worst of the worst. That's who Silas Carter was, and he had just blackmailed the sheriff into leaving them alone. The immediate threat was gone, but a much bigger, more terrifying truth had taken its place. Silas wasn't just a man with a dark past. His past was the law itself, and he had just used it like a weapon. What other secrets was he hiding? And what would happen when Ambrose found out that the law he was counting on was no longer on his side? The revelation settled over the cabin like a shroud. Silas was a lawman, or he had been a lawman. It explained so much. The way he moved, the cold efficiency of his violence, the authority that radiated from him even in silence. But it also raised 1,000 new questions. Why was he here, living like a hermit? What had made him leave the Rangers? What ghost was he trying to outrun? Clara didn't ask. She was afraid of the answers. Instead, a new, desperate resolve took root in her. She couldn't rely on Silas and his mysterious past forever. She had to find her own weapon to fight with, and that weapon was the truth. She started thinking about her husband, John, about his death. The story was that he'd been shot during a dispute over a mule. It had never sat right with her. John wasn't a fighter, and Ambrose had been all too quick to take over, to claim the debts, to pronounce her helpless. And then there was that note, not worth the land. It was a strange thing to write. An insult, yes, but a specific one. Why the land? It was a hard scrabble piece of dirt, barely able to grow enough to feed a family. Why was Ambrose so obsessed with it? Micah, fueled by his own simmering rage, became her partner. He remembered things. Pa was digging, he told her one night, his voice low. Out by the old oak. He told me not to tell Uncle Ambrose. Said it was a secret. The next day, while Silas was out checking his trap lines, Clara and Micah went to John's land. It was a painful journey back to a place haunted by memories. They found the spot Micah remembered, near a huge, lightning-scarred oak tree. The ground was disturbed, covered over with leaves and branches. They started digging. Their hands were raw and bleeding by the time they hit something hard. It was a small, locked metal box. Micah pried it open with a rock. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were a handful of papers. It was a surveyor's map, an assigned agreement between her husband, John Hayes, and a man named T.W. Garrison, representing the Union Pacific Railroad. Her hands shaking, Clara read the documents. The railroad was coming, and they weren't just passing through. They were planning to build a depot, a major hub for cattle and supplies, right in the middle of John's property. The agreement promised him a fortune. His dusty, worthless patch of land was about to become one of the most valuable properties in the state. And tucked in with the papers was John's journal. The last entry was dated the day before he died. Ambrose knows, he wrote, his handwriting shaky. He saw me with the surveyor. He says the land is his by right of blood. He followed me home from town today. I saw the look in his eye. If something happens to me, it was not an accident. He did it. He wants my land. The world tilted on its axis. It all clicked into place. The mule story was a lie. Her husband hadn't been killed in a random squabble. He had been murdered by his own brother for a piece of land that was about to make them rich. Ambrose hadn't just been cruel and abusive. He was a thief and a killer. The note, not worth the land, was his sick, private joke. He was telling the world that she, the grieving widow, wasn't worth the fortune he was about to steal. The truth was a physical blow. Clara sank to her knees, the journal clutched in her hand, a strangled sob escaping her lips. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. She and Micah rushed back to the cabin, their hearts pounding with a mixture of terror and grim purpose. They had to tell Silas. He was the law after all. He would know what to do. They burst into the cabin and found him sitting at the small table, cleaning his pistol. Clara spread the papers out on the table, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold them steady. "Silas," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "He killed him. Ambrose murdered my husband." Silas looked at the papers, his face unreadable. He picked up the railroad agreement. He read the name of the representative, T.W. Garrison, and his whole body went still. A flicker of something dark and ancient passed through his eyes. Recognition. "Garrison," he whispered, the name like a curse on his tongue. He looked up at Clara, and the mask was finally gone. She saw the ghost he'd been chasing. "T.W. Garrison," Silas said, his voice a low, raw growl. "He's the man I've been hunting for 5 years. He was a railroad baron in Colorado. He paid a gang to run a family of homesteaders off their land so he could get the mineral rights. But they wouldn't leave, so he had them burned out." Silas's voice broke. "My sister, her husband, their 2 little girls. That was the family." The air left the room. The two separate, tragic stories of their lives had just slammed together, fused by a single name. The man who had destroyed Silas's family was the same man in league with the monster who had destroyed Clara's. This wasn't a coincidence. This was fate, cruel and undeniable. Ambrose wasn't just a local bully. He was a pawn in a much larger, more dangerous game. And Silas wasn't just a protector. He was an avenger. The storm they had been fearing was here, and it was about to break with a fury that would tear Red Willow Crossing apart. The truth hung in the cabin, a terrible living thing. Ambrose wasn't working alone. He was backed by a rich, powerful man, a man who had killed before, a man who had destroyed Silas's entire world. "He won't give up," Silas said, his voice grim. "Now that the sheriff is spooked, Garrison will tell Ambrose to handle it himself. They can't afford witnesses." He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a new, terrifying urgency. "They're coming for these papers, and they're coming to silence you and the boys for good." The sanctuary of the cabin was gone. It was a trap. They were cornered. "What do we do?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We fight," Silas said. The word was simple, but the meaning was anything but. He began to move, the quiet farmer disappearing, replaced by the Texas Ranger. His actions were precise, economical, and chillingly effective. "Clara, barricade the windows. Use the mattresses, the table, anything. Micah, you're with me. We need water. Every bucket, every pot, fill it. They might try to burn us out." The boy didn't hesitate. He just nodded, his face pale but determined, and followed Silas outside. Clara's hands were shaking, but she did as she was told. She dragged the heavy pine table against the main window, her mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Just a few months ago, her biggest worry was where her son's next meal would come from. Now she was preparing for a siege. Silas and Micah worked quickly, hauling buckets of water from the creek and setting them just inside the cabin door. Silas pulled a heavy rifle from a hidden compartment under his cot, along with 2 boxes of cartridges. He checked the action, his movements fluid and practiced. He handed a smaller pistol to Clara. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked. She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "Point it at whatever's trying to get through that door and pull the trigger," he said, his voice flat. "Don't hesitate. Don't think. Just pull." He looked at Micah. "Son, you are my eyes and ears. I need you at the back window. You yell the second you see anything. Anything at all. You understand?" Micah nodded, his young face set in a grim mask. As dusk began to settle, casting long, spooky shadows across the prairie, the world outside went quiet. Too quiet. The birds stopped singing. The crickets went silent. It was the kind of hush that comes before a storm. They waited. Every creak of the cabin walls, every rustle of the wind in the willows, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. The minutes stretched into hours. The fire in the hearth burned down to glowing embers, plunging the cabin into near darkness. And then they heard it, the soft thud of horses' hooves on the damp earth. Not one horse, Many. Micah, pressed against the back window, whispered, "They're here. I see them. 5 of them. And Uncle Ambrose." Silas moved to the front door, peering through a tiny crack in the boards. He motioned for Clara to get down, to take cover behind the overturned table. "Stay low," he commanded, "and keep Everly with you." A voice called out from the darkness. It was Ambrose. "Carter, I know you're in there. You've got something that belongs to me. Send out the woman and the boys, and give me the papers, and I might just let you live." Silas didn't answer. He just raised his rifle, the long barrel resting on the edge of the windowsill. "Have it your way," Ambrose screamed, his voice raw with fury. The night exploded. A gunshot shattered the front window, sending a spray of glass and splintered wood into the cabin. Clara screamed, pulling Everly tighter against her. Another shot, and then another. They were firing blindly, trying to flush them out. Then a new sound, the whoosh and crackle of fire. "The barn!" Micah yelled from the back. "They've set the barn on fire!" Silas cursed under his breath. The orange glow of the flames lit up the yard, casting the attackers into silhouette. It was a classic tactic. Use the fire to draw them out into the open. But Silas wasn't going to fall for it. He took a steadying breath, sighted down the barrel of his rifle, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle boomed, the sound deafening in the small cabin. Outside, a man screamed and fell. One down. The other men scattered, diving for cover. The firefight had begun. Gunshots ripped through the night, tearing through the thin wooden walls of the cabin. Wood splintered, tin cups flew off the shelves, and the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Clara, huddled behind the table with Everly, felt a terrifying calm settle over her. This was it, the final battle. They would either walk out of this cabin into the dawn, or they would be buried in its ashes. And as she looked from the determined face of her son, Micah, to the grim, focused silhouette of Silas Carter, she knew one thing for sure. They would not go down without a fight. The cabin became a symphony of chaos. Gunshots, shouting, the roar of the burning barn, and the splintering of wood. Ambrose and his hired guns were circling the cabin, firing from the cover of darkness. They were trying to find a weak spot, a way in. Inside, Silas was a whirlwind of deadly motion. He moved from the front window to the back, never staying in one place for more than a second, firing his rifle with a calm, terrifying precision. Each shot was answered by a curse or a cry of pain from the darkness. He wasn't just shooting at them, he was dismantling them, piece by piece. Micah was a rock. He never left his post at the back window, his young voice cutting through the din. "One moving to the well, Silas. On the right." A moment later, the rifle would roar, and Micah would report, "He's down! He's not moving!" The boy was his eyes, guiding his aim, and in the middle of this hell, a strange bond was being forged between the former lawman and the boy who was fighting for his life. Clara, her heart pounding, knew she couldn't just hide. She crawled over to the water buckets, dipped a blanket in, and began to put out the small fires that had started to smolder where stray bullets had come through the walls. She was protecting their fortress from the inside. Then a new, horrifying sound, a heavy thud against the front door. And then another. They were using a log as a battering ram. The door shuddered, the wood groaning in protest. "Clara!" Silas yelled over the noise. "The door won't hold! Get ready!" He tossed his rifle to Micah. "Keep them busy!" he shouted, pulling out his pistol. He stood to the side of the door, his body pressed against the wall, his face a grim mask of determination. The door splintered. A huge crack appeared down the middle. One more hit, and it would give way. Clara scrambled to her feet, the small pistol Silas had given her clutched in her trembling hands. She had never fired a gun in her life. Crack! The door burst inward, ripped from its hinges. For a split second, Ambrose Hayes stood silhouetted in the doorway, his face a mask of triumphant rage. Behind him, 2 more men were rushing forward. Time seemed to slow down. Silas fired. The man on the right went down, clutching his chest. Micah, firing the rifle from across the room, hit the man on the left. But Ambrose was still coming. He lunged into the room, a huge hunting knife in his hand, his eyes wild. He was heading straight for Clara and Everly. He was a monster, intent on finishing what he started. Clara didn't think. She didn't aim. She just raised the pistol, pointed it at the center of the charging nightmare, and pulled the trigger. The gun bucked in her hand, the sound a deafening roar. Ambrose stopped. A look of complete surprise crossed his face. He looked down at his chest, where a dark red stain was already spreading across his shirt. He looked back up at Clara, his mouth opening as if to say something, but no words came out. He just staggered backward and collapsed in the doorway, his dead eyes staring up at the smoke-filled ceiling. It was over. The silence that descended was more shocking than the noise had been. It was broken only by the crackle of the dying fire outside and Everly's terrified sobs. Clara stood there, the pistol still smoking in her hand, staring at the body of the man who had tormented her. She had done it. She had killed him. She had saved her children. Suddenly, from the darkness outside, a new voice called out, "Silas Carter, this is U.S. Marshal John Stokes. Throw down your weapons and come on out." Silas looked at Clara, a slow, weary smile spreading across his face. "My message must have gotten through," he whispered. He had sent for help. He had planned for this. They walked out of the ruined cabin into the pre-dawn light. A group of armed men, U.S. Marshals, were standing there, their guns trained on the surviving hired thugs. Marshal Stokes, a tall man with a weathered face, looked at Silas and nodded. "Been a long time, Ranger." "Too long, John," Silas replied. The marshal looked at the carnage, at Ambrose's body, at the smoldering remains of the barn. "Looks like you handled things here." Then his eyes fell on Clara, standing tall and proud, her sons beside her. He saw the pistol still in her hand. He saw the fierce, protective look in her eyes. He looked back at Silas. "Or maybe," the marshal said with a respectful smile, "she did." The truth came out, all of it. John's journal, the railroad contracts, T.W. Garrison's name, the hired guns, eager to save their own skins, confessed everything. Ambrose hadn't just been a murderer. He was a key player in a massive conspiracy. Sheriff Elridge was arrested, his past as a cowardly bank robber exposed to the horrified town. And a warrant was issued for the arrest of T.W. Garrison, the railroad baron who had thought he was above the law. The town of Red Willow Crossing was forced to look at itself, at its cowardice, at the way they had turned their backs on a woman and her children. Their shame was a palpable thing. In the end, Clara got her justice. The land was hers, its value secured. She was no longer a helpless widow. She was one of the wealthiest women in the territory. But more than that, she was free. She and the boys stood with Silas, looking out over the prairie as the sun finally rose, washing the world in clean, new light. The nightmare was over. They had faced the storm and survived. They had built something in that little cabin, something far more valuable than land or money. They had built a family, forged in fire, bound by courage and protected by a quiet man who had finally found the one thing he had been searching for all along: redemption. They rebuilt the cabin, stronger this time. They rebuilt the barn, and together they built a new fence around the property, not to keep people out, but to mark the boundary of the home they had fought for and won. Some stories start with a rope and a fence post, in shame and in fear. But if you're lucky, and if you're brave, they can end with a hammer and a nail, building a future together. And if you enjoyed this story and you want to hear more tales of justice from the dark corners of history, do me a favor. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story.